My daughter left me in a nursing home to go on a trip with her new mother-in-law and left a note. Mom, this place is better for you. It's just for a few days. The next day, I canceled all the credit cards and planned a little surprise. I was already on my way to Miami. Margaret Reynolds had never considered herself old. At 68, she still wore red lipstick, refused to cut her silver-streaked auburn hair, and regularly did yoga with YouTube instructors half her age. She drove her own car, loved cooking Thai food from scratch, and had a mild obsession with true crime documentaries. So when her daughter Lisa insisted on a short stay at a retirement home in Tampa, Florida, Margaret expected maybe a tour, a free lunch, and then a return to her tidy bungalow in Sarasota. What she got instead was a suitcase, a kiss on the cheek, and a handwritten note left on her nightstand. Mom, this place is better for you, just for a little while. Love you always, Lisa. The handwriting had hearts over the eyes, as if that softened the blow. Margaret stood in the center of the sunny room with its beige walls and floral curtains, clutching the note in one hand and her purse in the other. There was a faint scent of lavender and disinfectant in the air, and someone down the hall was playing what sounded like Kenny Rogers on a small radio. The place was clean, bright, and almost aggressively cheerful. Still, it felt like being gently smothered with a crocheted pillow. A nurse named Jolene had greeted her earlier with too much warmth and far too many questions about her needs. Margaret answered with clipped politeness, holding herself upright like a queen in exile. She was assigned a cozy room with a twin bed, a dresser, and a nightstand that now held the offending note. Margaret had barely unpacked. At dinner, she sat at a round table with 3 other women who introduced themselves as Betty, June, and Call Me Cookie. They all wore pastel cardigans and talked about their grandkids' dance recitals and their blood pressure medication. Cookie had a mischievous glint in her eye, but even she couldn't distract Margaret from the slow, heavy realization forming in her chest. Her daughter had parked her here like a spare piece of furniture. That night, Margaret lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan above, listening to the low murmur of televisions and muffled coughs from nearby rooms. Her body was still, but her mind churned. She thought about her late husband, Gerald, and the road trips they used to take just for fun of it. She remembered chasing waves with Lisa on Clearwater Beach when she was just 6 years old, squealing and splashing. That little girl, so full of spirit. When had she become someone who made unilateral decisions for her mother? Sometime past midnight, Margaret couldn't sleep. She got up, slipped on her robe, and opened her suitcase to find her toothbrush. And there it was, tucked between her silk scarf and a pair of socks, her high school graduation portrait. It was one of those old black and white photos where she wore a modest white dress and looked straight at the camera with a stubborn fire in her eyes. Her hair was thick and dark back then, her smile half restrained but defiant. Looking at it now, Margaret could barely believe that young woman was still inside her, but she was just beneath the surface, waiting. The next morning, she dressed carefully. Not for anyone else, for herself. A flowing teal blouse, comfortable jeans, a touch of mascara. She declined the group breakfast, saying she didn't feel well, and stayed in her room with the curtains drawn just enough to let in a sliver of sun. The truth was, she was making a decision. Not rash, not emotional, deliberate. She didn't belong here. It wasn't about the people. They were kind. The staff was professional. The facility was probably among the best money could buy. But the idea of spending even a week being managed, scheduled, softened, no. That wasn't Margaret. That wasn't how she was going to end her story. Not when there were still places she hadn't seen again. Not when her bones still carried rhythm and her heart still sparked at the scent of jasmine and strong coffee. Not when her mind was sharp and her spirit, though bruised, wasn't broken. She went for a walk around the garden just before lunch, nodding to a few residents who were soaking up the sun. The garden was actually lovely. Marigolds, rosemary, a few old rocking chairs under the shade of oaks. But it was too peaceful. It whispered of surrender. That afternoon, back in her room, Margaret picked up the note from Lisa again and read aloud in a voice that mimicked her daughter's tone. "This place is better for you." She paused, tilted her head, then chuckled softly, not bitterly, but with the weary humor of someone who's seen enough to know what's best for herself. She folded the note neatly, slid it back into the drawer, and opened her small travel notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Things I will do before anyone else tries to manage me again. Drink Cafe Cubano in Little Havana. Wear heels again, even if only for 5 minutes. Dance. Somewhere. Somehow. Live." She stared at the list for a long moment. Then she added a fifth item. "Make Lisa sweat a little." Margaret leaned back, a small smile playing on her lips. Tomorrow, she decided, would be the beginning. But tonight, she would rest, not because she was tired, but because the next chapter required energy, and Margaret Reynolds had every intention of writing it herself. The morning sun crept through the blinds with a gentle persistence, casting thin golden stripes across the carpet of Margaret's room. She was already dressed, a navy blouse with a faint floral pattern and khaki slacks. Calm, composed, almost ceremonial in her readiness. Her mind had been made up during the quiet moments of the previous night, and now she moved with the quiet assurance of someone executing a mission. She packed only what she needed: 2 changes of clothes, her wallet, her notebook, and the portrait that had reignited her sense of self. Everything else, including the decorative pillows and pastel slippers Lisa had insisted on sending, was left behind like artifacts of someone else's narrative. She walked to the front desk just before 8 o'clock, smiling warmly at the receptionist and explaining, just heading out for a little stroll. There was no reason for suspicion. Margaret had been pleasant, obedient even, during her short stay, blending into the pattern of the facility like a new tile in an old mosaic. No one questioned her. No one asked where she was going or when she'd be back. She was to them harmless, a quiet widow settling in. They had no idea she was already on her way out. The taxi arrived right on time, its yellow body gleaming in the Florida sun like a cheerful accomplice. Margaret climbed in with quiet confidence and gave the driver a single instruction: downtown Tampa, Chase Bank on Franklin Street. He nodded and pulled away, the gate of the retirement home shrinking in the rear-view mirror. Margaret didn't look back. At the bank, she moved with precision. Years of managing household accounts, helping Gerald with real estate paperwork, and balancing her own modest investments had left her more than capable. She approached the teller with an air of polite authority, her ID and documents already prepared. "I need to separate this joint account," she said calmly, "and open a new one under my name only. No co-signers." The teller blinked, glanced at the birth date on her ID, and then nodded. There was no condescension, no attempt to redirect her to someone more appropriate. She was handled with professional courtesy, and within the hour, the money, a tidy sum collected over decades, was under her exclusive control. She then walked 2 blocks to a small mobile store and bought a prepaid phone. It wasn't fancy, just enough to make calls, send texts, and access email if needed. Lisa had always insisted on managing all the family's digital needs, passwords, devices, online banking. It was her way of helping. But Margaret had always felt a hidden leash in that arrangement. Not anymore. In the small cafe next door, over a cup of black coffee and a warm blueberry scone, Margaret composed a message she knew would send her daughter spiraling. "Lisa, I'm fine. Please don't worry. I'm going to take care of myself better than you imagine. I just needed some time alone. Don't try to find me. Love, Mom." She pressed send and immediately turned off the phone. No further explanations. No emotional negotiations. Lisa would panic, of course. But Margaret had no intention of playing therapist to her own child today. At the bus station, she stood in line behind a man in a cowboy hat and a woman wrangling twin toddlers. The terminal smelled of hot pretzels and industrial cleaner, and announcements echoed overhead in tinny bursts. When it was her turn, She stepped up to the counter and said simply, "1 ticket to Miami. One way." The attendant barely glanced at her. To him, she was just another traveler, not a runaway, not a grandmother seeking revolution, just a woman with a suitcase and a destination. On the bus, she chose a window seat and tucked her bag beside her feet. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Margaret looked out, watching the building slip by. There was no swelling music, no dramatic narration, just a rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional murmur of other passengers. She didn't need theatrics. The act itself, the choice to leave, was already her declaration. The trip to Miami took several hours, and somewhere along the vast stretch of Interstate 75, Margaret closed her eyes and let her thoughts wander. She didn't try to plan too far ahead. That would come later. Right now, her only objective was movement. Forward, away from the controlled corridors of the retirement home, away from the assumption that she had nothing left to do but fade gently into the background of other people's lives. She woke briefly when the bus stopped in Fort Myers, long enough to stretch her legs and buy a bottle of water. The young clerk behind the counter offered her a pitiful smile, and she returned it with one that was calm but unbothered. If anyone looked closely, they would have seen not frailty, but a kind of slow-burning joy. By the time they approached the outskirts of Miami, the sun was beginning to dip low on the horizon. The city shimmered in the distance, light glinting off the windows of high-rises and traffic crawling in familiar patterns. Margaret felt something she hadn't in years: anticipation. Not anxiety, not responsibility, anticipation. She disembarked with the others at the main station and hailed another taxi. Her Spanish was rusty, but she managed a decent Pequeño hotel in Little Havana, por favor, which made the driver smile and nod. The streets of Little Havana were alive, pulsing with color and sound. Music spilled from storefronts, murals covered every available wall space, and the scent of roasted pork and strong coffee lingered in the thick evening air. It was unlike Tampa in every possible way: louder, rougher, more honest. The hotel she chose was modest, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Her room was small but clean, with a ceiling fan that hummed like a lullaby and a window that overlooked a row of swaying palms. She unpacked only the essentials and placed her portrait of young Margaret on a nightstand. For the first time in days, she took a deep breath that filled her lungs not out of necessity, but out of genuine relief. She changed into a cotton dress, pulled her hair into a loose bun, and stepped outside. The street was buzzing, but she didn't need a map. She simply followed the music. As she walked, people passed her without a second glance, a woman in her 60s with good posture and curious eyes. She was invisible in the most liberating way. No one expected anything from her. No one needed her to explain or apologize. She reached a corner cafe and ordered cortadito, her first in decades. The barista, a wiry man with deep laugh lines and salt and pepper beard, winked as he handed it to her. She sipped, felt the sweetness and sharpness hit her tongue, and nearly laughed aloud. Margaret Reynolds was not done, not even close. The mornings in Little Havana began early. By 7 o'clock, the streets hummed with a rhythm that made Margaret feel, for the first time in years, like the world was not simply moving around her, but pulling her into its motion. The scent of pan cubano and espresso filled the air, wafting through open cafe doors and between street vendors unpacking guava pastries and sweet tamales from wax paper. Margaret sat at a metal table outside a cafe called El Gallo Negro, her notebook open beside her tiny ceramic cup. She had never been much of a coffee drinker back in Sarasota, but something about the strength and sweetness of this thick, molten Cuban brew made her feel bolder, clearer, a little wicked even. She was not alone for long. The table beside hers was soon occupied by 3 women, all around her age, dressed in bright colors and wrapped in the kind of conversational energy that made strangers feel instantly included. One of them, a woman in a vibrant sunflower yellow dress with thick silver bangles on each wrist, glanced at Margaret and smiled. "Primera vez por aquí?" she asked. Margaret caught the tone and the context more than the words, smiled back, and answered, "Yes, first time, but I already love it." The woman's face lit up. "You sit with us," she insisted. "I'm Carmen. These are my friends, Elena and Tita. We meet here every morning. It's therapy without insurance." There was no room to refuse. Margaret picked up her cup and joined them, laughing at Carmen's ease. The conversation switched fluidly between Spanish and English, touching on neighborhood gossip, city politics, and which bakery had recently started overcharging for medianoches. Margaret listened more than she spoke, but she laughed when appropriate, nodded when she caught the gist, and felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest, a strange, unexpected comfort. Carmen, it turned out, had once lived in the same Miami neighborhood where Margaret and Gerald had visited in the late 1980s. Back when the clubs were wild and the drinks were cheap, Carmen said with a grin. "You danced at El Zafiro, no? Everybody did. You don't forget a place like that." The name lit a memory in Margaret like a match. "Yes," she said, her voice touched with disbelief. "I was there once, a long time ago. My husband and I came to celebrate his promotion." "Well," Carmen replied, raising her eyebrows, "El Zafiro's still around, but the drinks are no longer cheap. The music, though, that's still fire." That same afternoon, Carmen took Margaret on a walking tour of the neighborhood. Not the one tourists got, but the one only someone who had lived and loved in Little Havana could give. They passed murals of Celia Cruz and Jose Marti, lingered at Maximo Gomez Park to watch the old men play dominoes with silent intensity, and stopped at a corner stall where Carmen insisted Margaret try a Memmi milkshake. "Trust me," she said, "this is a kind of fruit that reminds you life's not done surprising you." The shake was rich and strange and oddly comforting. Margaret drank it slowly, savoring its odd sweetness, like a secret she hadn't expected to keep. That evening they went dancing. Carmen had a nephew who owned a small boat charter company and moonlighted as a DJ at a local salsa club. "It's not a big place," Carmen warned, "but it's got heart. And they don't care how old your hips are, just that they move." Margaret stood in front of her hotel mirror for nearly 15 minutes, trying to decide what to wear. She finally settled on a simple black dress she hadn't worn in years, paired with a red shawl she bought from a street vendor that morning. Her hair, streaked with silver and defiance, she left loose. When she stepped out into the warm Miami night, she did not feel 68. She did not feel like someone's mother. She felt like a woman walking into her own story. The club was small, lit with soft red lights and filled with the kind of music that lived more in the chest than in the ears. Margaret let Carmen lead her to the dance floor, and when a gentleman in a navy shirt and salt and pepper hair asked her to dance, she said yes without hesitation. She didn't remember all the steps, but she moved. She laughed. She let the rhythm carry her. And when she sat down, breathless and glowing, she drank water from a plastic cup and felt younger than she had in years. Back at the hotel, Margaret fell into bed with aching feet and a heart that wouldn't settle. It was not fear that kept her awake. It was energy, the kind that comes not from caffeine but from contact. She wrote a few lines in her notebook before sleep finally took her. The next day brought more the same. Mornings with Carmen and the ladies. Afternoons walking the colorful streets, trying new food, making mental notes of places she wanted to return to. She began reading again, a novel she found in the hotel's shared library, and lost herself in the pages on lazy afternoons. One afternoon, Carmen invited her out on her nephew's boat. It was modest but clean, and the ride along Biscayne Bay was smooth and sun-drenched. Margaret stood at the bow, wind in her face, thinking not about what she had left behind, but about how much she still hadn't seen. Carmen sat beside her, munching on plantain chips and telling stories about her brief marriage to a musician who had once played backup for Gloria Estefan. At some point during the ride, Carmen leaned back, stared at the clouds, and said, "You know, I never asked what brought you here, but I think maybe I don't have to." Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched the water, calm and wide and glinting with light. "I just need to find out what else I could be," she finally said, before someone else decided for me. That night, back in her room, Margaret turned her phone on for the first time since she'd sent that message. It lit up with missed calls and frantic texts from Lisa, ranging from pleading to passive-aggressive to outright panicked. Margaret read them all, slowly, then put the phone back down without responding. "Not yet," Lisa's crisis was not her emergency. Not this time. She walked to the window, pulled it open, and stood there a while, watching the neighborhood slow down for the night. The music had softened. The laughter was quieter, but the air was still full of life. Margaret wasn't finished. Not with the city. Not with herself. Not with this strange, fierce new chapter she hadn't expected, but now couldn't imagine giving up. And somewhere in the silence of her room, a quiet thought formed, sharp and unsentimental. Let her sweat a little longer. Lisa paced the rental villa ceramic floor in Tulum. Her phone clenched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles turned pale. The tropical breeze that drifted through the open windows brought no comfort, nor did the pristine beach view that had once seemed like paradise. Her husband, Mark, lay half asleep on a hammock nearby, headphones in, pretending not to notice the rising storm of her anxiety. But the real problem, the actual hurricane, was sitting across the room in a stiff wicker chair, sipping sparkling water with a lime wedge as if it were a martini. Judith, Mark's mother, perfectly pressed in her beige linen pantsuit, watched Lisa with calm disapproval. "You should have called her," Judith said finally, her voice smooth but edged like glass. All that sneaking around, leaving a note, "Really, Lisa, what did you expect?" "I did call her. I've called her 15 times. She's not answering." Lisa snapped, though she immediately regretted the sharpness. Judith thrived on drama that didn't touch her directly, and Lisa had handed her a golden opportunity. She took a breath, tried to center herself, and sat down. It was supposed to be a short stay. I thought she'd adjust. I didn't think she'd just disappear. Judith gave a small laugh. "Your mother-in-law is more spirited than you give her credit for. Honestly, I rather admire it. If I ever end up in one of those places, I hope I'll have the guts to vanish without a trace." Lisa rolled her eyes and checked her phone again. The messages she had sent over the past few days looked more desperate each time she read them. "Mom, please respond. Where are you? I'm worried sick. At least tell me you're safe." There had been a brief reply, vague, composed, terrifyingly calm. "I'm fine. Don't worry. I'll take care of myself better than you imagine." That was it. No location. No follow-up. And now her joint bank account had been closed. The card she'd been using to pay for Judith's spa appointments, meals, and even the villa's deposit had been declined. Mark had shrugged and used his own card, but the tension between them had begun to calcify into something heavy and unsaid. Lisa felt as if the floor beneath her was shifting. Her control, the neat little system she had maintained since her father's death, was cracking. Margaret had always been compliant, always willing to go along with plans for the sake of peace. This wasn't just unexpected. It was mutiny. By the third day of silence, Lisa found herself booking a one-way flight back to Florida. Judith raised an eyebrow at the announcement but didn't object. "Do what you need to," she said, "but don't expect her to be waiting for you with cookies." The flight from Cancun to Miami was turbulent, both in the air and in Lisa's mind. Every possible scenario ran through her head. What if her mother was sick? What if she was with strangers, being manipulated? What if she had changed? Arriving in Miami brought no relief. The city was loud, humid, unapologetically alive. Lisa hadn't set foot there in over a decade, not since a forgettable spring break trip in college. The rental car took her through neighborhoods bursting with color and rhythm, none of which matched her anxious internal state. It took her a full day to track Margaret down. She started with financial records, found a new bank account location, then visited nearby hotels. After a string of polite rejections and unhelpful concierges, a woman at a small, family-run and finally remembered a silver-haired lady with a suitcase and a quiet smile. "Room 8, I think," she offered with a shrug. Lisa knocked 3 times, then again more firmly. She was not sure what she expected. Confusion, maybe, or a tearful reunion. But the door opened calmly, and there stood her mother in a loose blouse and sandals, her face tanned, her hair windblown, her eyes unmistakably sharp. "Hi, Lisa," Margaret said, as if she'd just run into her daughter at the grocery store. Lisa blinked, unprepared for flatness of her mother's tone. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Margaret stepped aside. "Come in, but only if you plan on listening." Inside, the room was tidy but lived in. A notebook lay open on the desk. A scarf hung over the back of a chair. Lisa sat cautiously on the edge of the bed while Margaret remained standing. "You can't just vanish," Lisa said finally. "You scared me." "No," Margaret corrected gently. "I surprised you. That's different." Lisa opened her mouth, but Margaret continued before she could speak. "I've been thinking, Lisa, about everything. About how you said this place was better for me. About how you dropped me off like luggage. And I understand, truly, you were overwhelmed. But what you did wasn't thoughtful. It was convenient." Lisa flushed. "I just wanted you to be safe." "No, you wanted me to be managed," Margaret replied, not harshly, but with clarity. "I get it. You're juggling a lot. A new marriage, a demanding mother-in-law. But I'm not an obligation you can outsource when it suits you." The room was quiet for a long time. Lisa finally asked, "So what now? You're just going to stay here?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, for a while. I'm not sure how long. But I like it. I'm meeting people. I'm dancing again. I'm doing things that remind me I'm alive, not just existing, until someone else decides what happens next." Lisa looked at her mother with new eyes. Not the frail woman she had imagined, but someone strong, capable, even radiant. It was uncomfortable. It was inspiring. It was a little infuriating. Margaret sat down, her voice softening. "Lisa, I love you. I always will. But I've spent most of my life putting others first. That stops now. I'm not punishing you. I'm reclaiming me." Lisa swallowed hard. "So what am I supposed to do?" Margaret smiled, not unkindly. "You could start by being honest. Really honest. Why did you bring me to that home?" Not the rehearsed answer, the real one. Lisa didn't speak for a long time. And then quietly, as her shoulders sagged, she said, "Because I was afraid of everything changing, of not knowing how to take care of you, of losing control. And now," Margaret asked. Lisa met her mother's eyes, tears barely restrained. "Now I realize I already did." Margaret reached out and took her daughter's hand, just for a moment. "Then maybe it's time we both learn how to live without control." The following morning, the city seemed quieter than usual, or perhaps it was just the way Margaret heard it through the open window of her hotel room. The breeze carried the scent of toasted bread and exhaust, and from somewhere nearby, a radio played a soft bolero. Lisa was still asleep on the pull-out bed, her arm draped awkwardly over her eyes. The previous night had ended not with a resolution, but with a kind of truce, a tired agreement to stay the night and talk again in the morning. No accusations, no dramatics. Margaret had offered a blanket and a towel, and Lisa had accepted both without complaint. It was strange to have her daughter there, not as a visitor, not as someone arriving with decisions already made, but as someone who, for once, was clearly out of her depth. Margaret made coffee in the small drip machine in the corner of the room, the kind with a stubborn switch and a crack in the carafe. As it sputtered to life, she leaned on the windowsill, watching the early walkers pass below, an older man pushing a cart full of mangoes, a pair of boys chasing each other down the sidewalk, a woman in high heels already dressed for something that demanded effort. She wondered, briefly, what would have happened if she had stayed in Tampa, if she had simply accepted the room, the schedule, the quiet descent into passivity. The thought now felt impossible, even absurd. When Lisa stirred, it was with the cautious hesitation of someone unsure of the tone to take. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair from her face and reaching for her phone instinctively before remembering it was still off. Margaret handed her a mug of coffee without a word, then sat down at the small table beside the window. "I didn't sleep well," Lisa admitted. "Neither did I," Margaret replied. "But I think that's a good thing." Lisa looked puzzled. "It means we're uncomfortable," Margaret explained. "Uncomfortable is where honesty starts." Lisa sipped her coffee. She didn't argue. After a long moment, she said, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about me making decisions for you." Margaret waited. "I think I've been doing that for years," Lisa continued. "Not just lately. Even before Dad died. I got used to treating you like someone who needed managing, like a project." "That's fair," Margaret said. But I made it easy for you to believe I was fine with it. Lisa stared at her mug. I was scared you'd fall apart. And if you did, then I'd have to face the fact that I didn't know what to do either. It was easier to pretend I had control. Margaret smiled, though not smugly. You never had control, sweetheart. You just had momentum. They sat in silence for a while, the city continuing outside their window, as if the world were in no rush to intervene. Eventually, Lisa stood and crossed the window. So, she said, what now? Do you want me to leave? No, Margaret said. I want you to see what this looks like. What I look like when I'm not being managed. Lisa gave a faint, incredulous laugh. You mean this new Miami version of you who drinks Cuban coffee and goes dancing? Yes, Margaret said, folding her hands in her lap. That version. Lisa nodded slowly. She's more intimidating than I expected. That's because she's not afraid anymore. Margaret offered to take Lisa to El Gallo Negro for breakfast. The usual table was already occupied by Carmen and the others, who greeted Margaret like a returning queen and eyed Lisa with open curiosity. Carmen's expression shifted to something knowing when Margaret introduced her daughter, not warm, but not unkind either. The conversation flowed around them, fast and bilingual, and Lisa's polite smile grew more genuine as she listened. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to see that her mother was not out of place here. She belonged. Later, as they walked through the neighborhood, Margaret pointed out her favorite murals. The bakery that made guava pastries without skimping on the filling. The park where the old men played dominoes with the seriousness of surgeons. Lisa said little, but she observed closely, visibly absorbing the small details that stitched together this life her mother had quietly built. That afternoon, back in the room, Margaret sat Lisa down. I'm not going back to Tampa, she said plainly. Not now, not for a while. I figured, Lisa replied. She didn't sound disappointed, just resigned. I've found something here, Margaret continued. Not just the people or the food or the music, though all that helps. I found myself again, and I'm not giving that up just because it's inconvenient for you. I'm not asking you to, Lisa said. You did, Margaret countered. Before, when you dropped me off. Maybe not with words, but with your actions. Lisa nodded quietly. You're right. Margaret took a breath, then reached for her notebook. She flipped to a page near the back and handed it to Lisa. These are some of the things I want to do, before I get too old or too tired, or forget why I wanted them in the first place. Lisa read the list. It included things like learn to play piano again, go to a poetry reading and actually read something, rent a car and drive to Keys alone, and get a tattoo, maybe. When she looked up, Lisa was smiling. Can I add something? She asked. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Have a real conversation with my daughter that doesn't involve guilt or obligation. Margaret laughed, not unkindly. That sounds like something we can both check off soon. They spent the evening at the marina with Carmen and her nephew. The boat ride was shorter this time, but filled with soft laughter and a gentle breeze. Lisa sat quietly, looking out the water, her posture looser, her eyes less guarded. Margaret didn't press. There was still more to say, more work to be done between them, but for now this was enough. By the time the sky turned pink and gold, Lisa turned to her mother and said, I want to understand this version of you. I don't want to lose her again. Margaret looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw the woman behind the worry, the fear, the mistakes. She saw the little girl she had once held and the grown woman she had accidentally allowed to become too responsible too soon. Then don't try to change her, Margaret said softly. Just walk beside her. And with that, something between them shifted, not dramatically, not with fireworks, but like a tide turning slow and deep. Neither of them knew exactly where things would go next, but for the first time in a long time, they were walking toward something together. And Margaret, still independent, still defiant, still sipping Cafe Cubano, was finally walking forward on her own terms.